Very happy to be here and talk a little bit more about retrofitting. I was very pleased to see Mr. Amaya's presentation, also with some focus on retrofitting. Hope we can have a good dialogue also after the presentations about that. So one of the reasons I'm very keen on talking about retrofit is that 70% of the buildings in operation today were built before the current energy codes. That, of course, means that there's a lot of opportunity, untapped potential for really saving a lot of energy. Now, buildings are, of course, not the entire energy usage. We have the street lighting as well that we need to look at. There's a lot of other things that we need to look at. Transport is another important energy consumer and polluter in our cities. But we need to look at the buildings, and one of the reasons is that our cities have a challenge, not just in terms of energy consumption, but also in terms of pollution. But 45% of all greenhouse gases in our cities come from buildings. It's because of the energy consumption of the buildings that derives from that. It actually constitutes, on average, globally, 45% of the total greenhouse consumption, greenhouse gas emission from the cities. About 50% of the buildings' operational footprint come from heating and cooling. So I was very pleased to see also the focus in Abu Dhabi around the chiller retrofits. I think those are a critical part of it. I think there's more we can do about it. The split units, definitely a challenge because they are smaller units, and generally smaller units on average have lower efficiency than larger central units. So there's a lot of opportunity of looking at how do we retrofit our buildings without risking going into a sick building syndrome, of course. We need to maintain the good indoor air quality. We need to maintain the structural integrity of our buildings as well. So I mentioned already that 70% don't comply with the energy codes, but another important figure is about 90% of all the buildings in operation today will still be in operation by 2050. What does that mean? Well, that means that if we don't fix the existing buildings, it will be close to impossible, actually totally impossible, for our cities to meet the energy climate targets that they have, because 90% are not retrofitted. Yes, we saw also earlier from UNEP information that we will have about 50% of the buildings will still be new buildings in 2060, but that's just because we're constantly expanding our urban footprints. More and more people are moving into the cities, meaning the challenge is just getting bigger. We need to be aware, if we tear down existing buildings and just build new, that sounds like a good concept because then the new building, we can just define that has to be net zero building. But every building we build carry a carbon debt for 30 years before it's repaid if it's net zero when it's built. So that means if we build it today, it will actually only be net zero by 2052. And we need to be carbon neutral before then. So why is it so hard to get it right? What is it that we can look at doing? Well, one of the challenges we have is the structure of how things are done. And take this as a little bit of mind game that I'm doing here to sort of prepare for some of the other dialogue that we need to have. Someone else is paying the bill. Facility managers, they don't need to invest in energy savings because they're not paying the energy bills. Property owners, well, they're not motivated by energy savings. They're motivated by keeping the tenants, by getting the leases renewed, and that's how they make their business. That's the profitability of the property owners. That's having their buildings fully occupied. Half-occupied buildings are not a good business. So they don't want to invest a lot, raise the rents, and scare off the clients. Tenant retention and lease renewal is also now more and more, especially with the pandemic, linked to the working environments, the requirements for comfort, but also indoor air quality that we've heard a lot about during today already. And that's not just filtering. The split units that we saw on the previous slides were also have a challenge of noise. They create noise in the local environment around where people are working, living, so we need to also tackle the noise challenge. So most sustainable solutions are unfortunately often more expensive, but that's on the upfront investment. We need to look at the total cost of ownership. We need to find ways of managing and incentivizing investments for the long run. And challenge is when you have a contractor, he's often looked at from the initial investment. What is the upfront cost of doing the installation? And then we choose the contractor based on that. But that also motivates the contractors to choose the lowest cost solutions, which are not necessarily the most sustainable solutions. So we need to look at how do we legislatively manage that challenge, how do we secure that it's enforced, but how do we also financially incentivize property owners as well as contractors to do the right thing. Operation cost and sustainability often takes a lower priority because we need to address the worker needs first, because that's, again, the companies renting the commercial properties, they want their workers to be happy. Happy workers stay longer with the companies, and the companies are more profitable. But there are some simple solutions that we can do. Looking at the market here, I mean, one of the challenges, a lot of systems were sold with constant speed. By just upgrading those to variable speed solutions on all of the existing fans, we can easily save up to 40% energy on the fan side. The chillers, of course, are a very important part of the total energy cost, but the ventilation of the buildings also have a substantial share of that. Additionally, most of the motors installed in the buildings today are IE1 motors. That is the lowest efficiency class that we have. Today, you can get standard induction motors in IE4, and each efficiency class you increase, you actually reduce the internal losses in the motor by 20%. Now that means that if you go from IE1 to IE4, which you can do without changing anything else in the system, you actually save 49% of internal losses in the motors. And they're mounting compatible because it's IEC. That specifies it's the same footprint, it's the same flanges, it's the same shaft for the same power. Additionally, surveys have shown very clearly that just by adding energy monitoring and visualization of the energy usage in a building quite often saves 10% energy, just like that. Suddenly people realize what they're spending energy on, when they're using it, and that in itself motivates them to actually reduce the energy usage. Not controlling anything, not changing anything, it just incentivizes people's behavior. In addition, then, when we look at adding management of the building more efficiently and more intelligently, that's an additional 15% saving that we can achieve. So the building management systems, we need to look at that, and I mean the new energy performance directives in Europe also mandates that all larger retrofits, all new buildings have to have energy building management systems. Now, does that mean it works? Not necessarily. In New York City, a survey was made pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. The occupancy of the building dropped 70%. So you would expect a substantial energy saving from that. But the energy consumption of the buildings, unfortunately, only dropped 10% because occupancy wasn't a factor. The lease contracts for the buildings determined the temperature that was supposed to be maintained during the day, occupied or not. So we need to keep a focus on solutions, and we need to find ways to make sure that we can implement the low-hanging fruits in an efficient way. So how can we accelerate this? First of all, making it visible. The tenants need to have means to actually require that something is done. As a company, we prefer to be in buildings that are, for instance, gold certified. But if it's not it's not certified at all, if there's no visibility to the energy labeling or the IQ labeling of the building, it's hard to make demands. But if we go in with a program where we actually visualize what is the performance of each specific building, now the tenants can have an awareness, and then they can start setting the requirements. Because if you have an IAQ labeling and it's very low, then tenants will start asking, well, I mean, we want good air quality here. Could you do something about that? Now it becomes a property owner requirement. That means it becomes a facility manager requirement, and then investments will come. What's being done in Europe, and what I find really motivating, I also mentioned that in the first panel discussion, is with the Energy Performance Directive in Europe, they're not setting a specific level that every country needs to get to. They're saying each country has a certain level today, and we all have to contribute. So the lowest 15% performing buildings have to go up 2 energy classes. And I think that's very motivating because we're not all in the same situation. We need to allow that there are differences, and there will continue to be differences before everybody catches up. So setting requirements that are flexible and mandated relative to the actual performance that exists already today, in many cases will be better than just setting a very high level for everybody. And then we need to, as I was also mentioned in the previous section, we need to look at the market surveillance. Because if there's no enforcement, then it's too easy to cheat around the corners. And unfortunately, it's the way some people make money is cutting a leg and cutting a toe and just finding ways to manage at a lower cost. I've seen projects where my best assumption is contractor bid was actually at their cost level. How do they then make money? Well, it's by finding solutions that are maybe a little less expensive that almost meet the specification. In terms of sustainability, another aspect is, for me, that's important is we've had a very linear economy for decades. We buy things, we use them, and we throw them out. That's linear economy. Then we started talking about recycling. We collect materials, and then we rework them into new products. And that's absolutely a lot better. But what we need to get to is we need to get to a more circular economy where we use product and then can rework that product or repair it so we can actually extend the lifetime. Now, obviously, if we have an IE1 motor, it's very difficult to just rework that into an IE4 motor. So there will be certain things that we need to change on and just reuse the materials. But a lot of product can actually be reused in the same function and still work very, very well for many, many years if they are designed to be repairable. We've seen in a lot of industries a strong integration of product, several different functions merging into one product, and some of those platforms are not repairable. That means that an extended mass of material needs to be scrapped every time a failure occurs. So in summary, remember 90% of all the buildings you see around you today will still be around in 2050. It takes 30 years to pay back the carbon debt of a new build. So let's look at how we can retrofit our buildings instead and make them almost net zero at least. Some buildings can be net zero, but a lot of buildings are not designed in a way that allows that. But it's still better than carrying the 30-year debt of a new build. Without retrofitting, we cannot meet the climate goals of our cities. And by just adding drives and motors and controls, we can easily save up to 50% of the energy in our existing buildings. So the opportunities are there. There's a lot of low-hanging fruits. We just need to work together to get the legislative part to work. We need to have the financial incentives, and that can be both positive incentives, that there's some financial support for upgrading, but it can also be negative incentives, meaning if you don't perform to a certain level, there's a fine for non-performance. All of this needs to play together, as well as, of course, working as manufacturers to provide solutions that allow us to integrate into existing buildings. Thank you.